Good afternoon, everybody. We also have some cushions on the stage, so if anybody wants to come and join us up on stage, you're more than welcome to make yourself comfortable up here. All right, we'll just give everybody a second to go ahead and get settled. My name is Awoye Timpo. I'm a theater director here in the city, and I'm just so thrilled and honored to be here on such an amazing and incredible day. I just want to thank Eve for such a beautiful, incredible performance, and to all these wonderful women who are in the audience tonight. It is a great, great pleasure to introduce everybody here to Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw. So Kimberlé is the co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum, and in addition to all her incredible work there, she's also a professor of law, both at Columbia and at UCLA. So we're just so grateful to have you and your expertise here today. Thank you.
It's an honor. Honor to be here.
Is this your first time seeing the performance?
No, I saw it in Cambridge.
So seeing it again, what are some of the things that are resonating for you? So many things.
Well, I think the first time I saw it, 45 was not, we were not fully into the world that has been created by 45. So much of the trauma that Eve invokes in it, at the time, one could feel that we were on an upward trajectory away from that. Now we're not in that space. Yeah. I see our politics as the Gulf oil spill all over again, over everything. So that resonated deeply, so much that, I had my own moment of almost, not really being able to continue to breathe through it. So the moments of, taking a breath and resettling, that I went through that process as I was experiencing the play. And of course knowing, that our moms are here, and so much of the trauma on the body, so much of the, what does a mother's arms wrapping around a child say? That they're home. Well, what happens when that child has been ripped from you by the police? What happens to you when you're forced to see this happen? So that trauma was front and center in my mind, knowing that part of why we're here is to deal with precisely this kind of dynamic.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I think over the course of the time that Eve has been doing the show, we've been talking a lot about pain and trauma and how to move through it. And it seems like one of the things that you're doing, of course, as someone who's launched the Say Her Name initiative, is to also create space for women to be able to come together, to have that space to move through that pain and trauma together. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you started the Say Her Name initiative.
Yeah. So we were just talking about this last night. The mothers have come together every year to provide each other that support, only support that other mothers. They've called it a sorority that they don't want anyone else to join. But it is a sorority, and it is one in which women consistently are joining it. Mothers who've lost daughters to police. We started it when we went to the Eric Garner march after the No bill came down. We marched with a poster that had 12 of the names of African American women who've lost their lives to police violence. And we more or less thought we were just going to be joining the march with other people lifting up the names. And as we were marching, there are a lot of chants that people say that have the names of the people. Like we're shutting it down for Michael Brown, that sort of invoking the name to make the demand. So we started chanting along the names of some of the people that had lost their lives: Michelle Cassot, Tanisha Anderson, all of the women that we know about. And we got 3 different reactions. Most people had no idea that Black women also were killed. so much has, I mean, we can do this here. Everyone put up your hand for a moment. Everyone, just put up a hand for a moment. When you hear the name of someone you don't know, put your hand down, okay? Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile. All right, so most hands are still up, okay? Tanisha Anderson, Kayla Moore, Michelle Cusseau, Shelley Frey, right? India Kager, India Beatty. All right, so there are 3 hands left up. Now this just demonstrates, right? So these are all African Americans who've been killed by the police within the last 4 years. The names that pretty much everybody knows, those are all men's names. The names that virtually nobody knows, those are all women's names, right? So we're dealing with an issue not only unspeakable loss, unspeakable loss, but then the loss is not spoken by those of us who care about this issue. So the basic idea was just to make the demand that we say their names only by saying their names. Do we lift up their memories? And only by lifting up their memories can we embrace their mothers. And only by embracing their mothers can we support the call for justice. So that's what Say Her Name is.
And I wonder if you can talk to, because I know the Policy Forum released a report a couple of years ago called Say Her Name. If you could just give us a little bit of the statistics of the number of Black women who have been killed in relation to the number of Black men.
Right. So the police violence is disproportionately a male problem for white men as well as for all men of color. But among women who are killed by the police, Black women are dramatically, disproportionately more likely to lose their lives to police violence, in the same way that Black women are more likely to be the ones who are arrested rather than diverted, in the same way that Black girls are the fastest growing group of juvenile detainees, in the same way that Black women are disproportionately likely to be prosecuted and convicted for the same kinds of offenses that other women are not. So the disproportionate involvement of Black women with police leads to disproportionate death rate at the hands of police. And I should say that the deaths have been caused by all sorts of things. So Tanisha was having a mental health crisis. Police were called. Many of them are not trained. They see every problem as one that requires coercion and force. Tanisha was not under arrest. She had done nothing wrong. She basically didn't want to be put into a police car. And they responded to that as though they would respond to a crime.
And an ambulance wasn't sent, because I believe there was a 911 call that was placed, and an ambulance wasn't called, but rather police officers were sent.
And people should know across the country, when there is a mental health crisis, 911, for the most part, doesn't bring mental health support, it brings coercion in the police. And then they decide that they want to secure the perimeter, so they pulled a gun on the family while the family had to watch them effectively killing their loved ones. These people have never apologized. The family just found out recently, and I'll leave it to them to speak to it if they wish, that these men were not going to be prosecuted, and they didn't even have the courtesy to call them on the phone to tell them this. They found out watching television. Now, police violence is a problem for all of us, any of us. I do believe that the special disregard for Black motherhood, for our connection to our children, for our love for our daughters, can only explain the callous disregard, first of allowing these policies, and then when something has been ruled a homicide, which has happened, not to charge them, and not to have the courtesy to sit down with them and explain the decision. I think that's what's unique about the vulnerability of Black women.
It's like an extra level of disrespect beyond the absurdity of the event itself, and especially because the murder took place about 2 years ago. To have that, then the news just came out on this a couple days ago. Is that right?
Yes. So it took place. The homicide was 4 years ago, right? Yeah, and so they're just finding out.
And I wonder if you could talk to just about the kind of disproportion in terms of the reflection in the media of the men's cases versus the women's cases. I mean, the Tanisha case specifically took place within the same county and actually within the same 2-week period as the Tamir Rice case.
Right. Right.
So I wonder if you could talk about, and there was video involved in that, but I wonder if you could just talk about how you see the difference between those two.
Well, and this is the dimension of the exercise that we gave that I think demonstrates the gendered erasure of Black women's bodies, because Tanisha did lose her life within weeks of Tamir Rice, and Tamir Rice was an unspeakable tragedy. A child being killed because he was playing with a toy gun. It is also an unspeakable tragedy for a family to lose a loved one when the police were called to help and they ended up killing. One tragedy we know about and the other one we didn't. And if we look at all of these cases, people, the same area, the same police department has been involved in these killings. So for every man that I mentioned, there's a woman in the list who've been killed by the same police department, or at least in the same region. So the fact that we know one and not the other meant that decisions are being made as to which cases warrant our attention, which cases get lifted up, and which cases are just obscured. And it's not a matter of whether there was evidence, not a matter of whether there is videotape. Rhonda's daughter, Corrine, who's here, her daughter filmed her encounter with the police. The police asked Facebook to turn off the feed. They complied. She was dead within minutes. So this is a forced erasure of what happens both before, which was the case of Corrine, and what happens afterwards. So this is part of the struggle to force awareness about this vulnerability, about this loss of life.
And it sounds like, so much of the work that you're doing through the African American Policy Forum is both acknowledging kind of the absurdity of the situations that are happening, and also trying to think of very specific policy initiatives that can be enforced in order to seek justice. And I wonder, as we've been having these conversations around Eve's play, I've been asking people if they could change the narrative about a certain thing or create a new language to help us think about an idea in a new way. What would it be? And typically we're talking in abstract, kind of large, aspirational terms, but in your case, you have actually created a word that has been inserted into kind of our national conversation and has been used to change policy. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your work and the creation of the word intersectionality and how you're able to use it to change policy.
Yeah. Well, I say necessity is always the mother of invention, and that's with respect to all things, including the need to bring invisible dimensions of the lives of Black women into conscious awareness. If we can't conceptualize it, we're unable to see it, and when we don't see it, there's nothing that we can solve. So intersectionality was just a term that I tried to use to create a word picture so people could understand what happens to Black women across the social terrain that typically falls between the cracks of the way we think about racial justice and the way we think about gender justice. So many of the cases that I was working with 30 years ago were cases with black women who were saying, look, this has happened to me, and none of the movements, none of the policies, none of the laws that have been built around anti-racism and that have been built around feminism have been capacious enough to include the way we as black women experience both of these things. So it started with employment discrimination, just basic jobs that black women didn't get hired for, and white women would get hired, and black men would get hired, but black women wouldn't. And courts would basically say, well, you haven't experienced a problem because it hasn't happened to men who are black, and it hasn't happened to women who are white, so you can't say it's racism, and you can't say it's sexism. Well, actually, a lot of things happen to black women that might not happen in the same way to their male counterparts, and might not happen in the same way to their white counterparts, but it's still racism, and it's still sexism. So there was something that people weren't able to see. So intersectionality was just a way of saying, we go through intersections every day. We cross them every day with traffic coming in one direction and traffic coming in another direction. Well, what if we thought about that traffic as racism on one hand, and traffic in another direction as sexism, patriarchy, and we might even think about other traffic coming through that intersection, like homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia. These are all aspects of power that many times merge in intersections. Well, if you happen, because of who you are, to be located in that intersection to receive all of these things, then you're going to be impacted by this stuff, sometimes simultaneously. So that's the first part of intersectionality, the vulnerability to all of these structures. But the second part, and the part that leads to the silence that led so many of us not to know the names of the women, is the fact that when our social justice policies and advocacy and mobilization show up at the scene of the collision, many times they're only trained to look for the people who are run over by the race traffic, or the people who are impacted by patriarchy. And many of the women that we know about, their daughters, they're impacted by all of that stuff there. So if you're only trained to intervene on a slight limited view of what the problem is, you'll see someone and say, not my problem, and get in the car and speed away. So intersectionality points both to the structural things that happen, but also the fact that we're not prepared to deal with it. That's why people don't know these cases. That's why these moms basically are suffering largely in silence, because we don't have a capacious enough view to think about violence against women to include police violence. Think about anti-black violence to include violence against black women. So intersectionality is trying to lift up both of those things.
And what is the kind of the challenge to changing people's notion of that idea? Like, what are the steps to actually making people see that there is intersectionality, or what's the thing that we're trying to bridge across in order to understand what the problem is?
Well, I think one problem now is that people think it's just an academic term. It's not really about real people's lives and loss of life. So, ideas travel, they take on, a life of their own. What we're consistently challenged to do is to say, however you might want to use intersectionality, in reality, real people's lives are at stake. The longer it takes for us to understand injustice through an intersectional lens, the longer it will take for us to create the prophylactic measures to prevent it. The longer it will take for us to be able to articulate and demand broad societal accountability for these issues. So now the challenge is basically everyone thinks they know what it is, and I can't, I don't want to say it's a terrible thing that a lot of people have heard about intersectionality, but now, just how they say a lie gets around the world before truth puts its boots on, now terms travel before the bodies catch up with it. So some people think intersectionality, they don't even know that it comes out of black women's history. They don't know it comes from, challenging sexual harassment since we got here. Sexual harassment is something that now is in the public domain. It came from the challenges and struggles of Black women. So we know that an idea can get out away from us and that we have to struggle to stay in it. That's what the struggle is now.
So we're about 20 years after Eve did the Vagina Monologues about 20 years ago, and it was, such an important moment in telling stories, giving voice to people's stories. And I know that the African American Policy Forum is also now has some art initiatives, and there's going to be a program that will be done at the African American Museum in DC. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your work with art and social change and the importance of telling stories.
Yes. Yes, thank you so much for asking that. And, this is clearly, Eve has many offspring. And one of her many offsprings would be the arts and activism dimension of the African American Policy Forum. One of the gifts that Eve brings to us is the capacity to see how important art is to expression, to raising consciousness, to bringing people into an understanding sometimes when words are not enough. So we believe that it's important for women who are subject to intersectional erasure to have platforms to be able to express what we do not know about their lives, what we've not seen. So for 3 years, we've been doing that. We've been going all around the country, having town halls. We've had them in 13 cities, all major cities and some small ones, to bring women forward to speak to that gap, that erasure. So many people, even people who look like us, stakeholders, have no idea about their stories, no idea about girls being tossed out of school or thrown across the room, no idea about any of these. So we created this space for them to tell the stories to stakeholders, their ministers, their other family members, their elected officials, their philanthropists, all the folks who've not shown up. But we also realized it wasn't enough just to give testimony, that there needed to be spaces and opportunities for people to come together to develop deeper awareness and capacity to express this across multiple venues and multiple media. So the arts and activism came out of that. We have some amazing artists here, Abby Dobson, who's a singer-songwriter, Afia Walkingtree, who's a percussionist who's here. We brought all these people together with many of our mothers and women across the spectrum and developed modalities of singing and podcasting and documentary filmmaking so they could express that. Now we're taking it on the road. And so every last week of March, the last week of March is Black Women's History Week. We've had it declared by our own Senator Gillibrand here as Black Women's History Week. And each day we devote a day to lifting up some aspect of the socioeconomic marginalization of Black women, ranging from, they have the highest rate of maternal mortality in the developed world. The rate of maternal mortality for Black women is the equivalent of underdeveloped countries. And it's far, far different from white women. So we bring attention to issues that people don't know about. So on Wednesday, we're going to have another arts and activism event built around the legacy of Harriet Tubman, where groups will come together, we'll have lecture, we'll have meditation, and then we'll develop movement and drumming and spoken word, all to link our lives together to Harriet Tubman. And then on Thursday, we're going to the African American Museum, having an evening on being Harriet's daughters, and it will end with that. I'll leave you with this about why Harriet. Harriet is going to be on the $20 bill, and we thought, how ironic, this Black woman who lived an entire life in absolute poverty, despite the fact that for the Civil War she was a scout, a spy, a nurse, a cook, a provisions supplier, an advisor, a recruiter, and a nurse. She never got paid for all of her work, right? So to us, this is Black women never getting paid for the fact that their labor, both productive labor and reproductive labor, created the basis for the wealth of this country. And they have never gotten a penny of it. So that's bad enough. When she finally did get paid, she got paid as the wife of a private whose name has been, we don't know Harriet Tubman's husband. This to us was singularly symbolic of the challenge that we have to develop opportunities for African American women that are not based on trickle-down ideas. Get it from your husband, or get it from your... Black women should be able to be paid in their own right. So we want to use the irony of Harriet Tubman showing up on something that she never got access to come back and ask, what's up? How is this going down like this? And so the evening is an attempt to think about that and speak back to it.
That's incredible. Yeah. So I just want to open it up to a couple questions before we wrap up for the day. Does anyone have any questions for Professor Kim?
And I also want to add that our mothers are here, so if folks have questions about the status of their daughters' cases or just what needs they have, I'm sure they want to answer.
Yeah, we have a question down here. And I'll repeat the question for everybody.
You talked about the police not having the right training. Anything doing with, let's say, a liberal mayor like Mayor de Blasio getting the right training for the police? Or is this something that we have to live with forever, that they don't know how to handle people who have issues?
She just has a question about police training and if there's a difference with police training depending on the party of the mayor.
Yeah.
So this is Tanisha's sister, Jennifer.
Nice to meet you.
Come sit
As for Cleveland, we did get, where now the police officers have to take training. It's a 40-hour training course to deal with a person who's having a crisis. The police officer that came to our house was not really informed about how to be able to communicate with a person that's in a crisis state. They don't know how to talk to them. They don't know how to calm this. Instead of escalating, de-escalate it. It's what we needed. We didn't need them to come in with force. We need them to come in with kindness and compassion. This is still a person. And at this state in their mind, they really don't have control about what it is that's going on with them. So for us, we did at least get that part where we established where they have to have more training to be able to deal with anybody that's having crisis.
Good afternoon. I'm the mother of Corrine Games, who was killed August 1st, 2016. She was at home with my grandson and her fiance and my granddaughter, and she was actually having a crisis, and the police were made aware when I got to the scene early that morning. She was the young lady that was shot, and my grandson was also shot twice by this officer, Ruby, from Baltimore County Police Department. When I got there, I made them aware. I had her doctor on the phone, and the officers refused to talk to her outright. They wouldn't even let it was 8 family members on the site with my daughter. They wouldn't allow us to communicate with her. Let me tell you how far they went. They took my phone and communicated with her and my family members as though they were me. You know, the support from the police department in Maryland for crisis is really awful. They have no training, you know. So, you know, I'm happy that you guys were able to get something in place. We're still fighting for that. You know, the fact that they would just omit the fact that somebody was there that could have offered them some sense of what she may have been going through and how to handle it, you know. And we just settled in a civil case, which money means nothing to me. Let me make that clear. The reason why we pursued the civil case was to make people aware of what really happened. It had nothing to do with money. I don't give a darn if I get a dime of that money. But we wanted the truth to come out. My daughter was shot in her back through a wall. Hit punctured both of her lungs, her T9, and her aorta. And the officer, by testimony from his fellow officers, went in and engaged her 3 more times, sent a mass. When she was on, the medical examiner and the experts for the state said that she was killed with the first shot.
And tell them what it was over.
A traffic violation. Okay? They came to serve or pick her up for a failure to appear. They went and got a key because she wouldn't open the door and entered her property. And yes, she was sitting there with her shotgun.
Legally owned.
Legally owned. But when
you
you come in somebody's house first thing in the morning, it came out in evidence that they did not identify themselves. That's number one. And then you come in, you hear, and I'm gonna tell you why she had the shotgun, because she had had a situation like that a couple of years where somebody actually broke into her house. I've had people, social media, well, what the hell was she doing with the gun? She was invoking her Second Amendment right. It was legally owned. But if you don't know who's entering your property, you have every right to protect your family and your space.
And at a point, I mean, there should be no reason to have to justify the fact that she legally had the gun in the first place. Absolutely.
So she was basically killed because she wouldn't come out.
Right.
In the same way, I have to say that, Tanisha was killed because she wouldn't comply.
Right.
These are all moments. Sandra Bland is dead, whether by suicide or not, because of an attitude, because police many times think that their responsibility is to take control. So whether it's an attitude, a refusal to come out, that moment of resisting turns it into a moment where excessive force they think is justified. So training, yes, we definitely need more training. One of our mothers, Fran Garrett, who's the mother of Michelle Cusseau, who was killed, was able to come to some agreement with the police officers to send mental health professionals in such cases. So there's some pockets where this is turned up, but the overall problem is that police generally are not well trained in de-escalation, and there are consequences for them when they don't de-escalate and they end up killing someone who is not under arrest or who presented no threat to them or is being picked up on a minor violation. That's our problem right there.
And I would love to sit and talk with you all day, and thank you so much for coming up and for telling us your stories. We are just so grateful to have you here. Thank you. We have time for one more question. I see a hand up in the back.
Yep. I teach at the Young Women's Leadership School of Queens, and we just went to see an art gallery exhibit on citizens, and one of the pieces, I don't remember the artist, but she had these 2 television screens with Black women wearing white, and they were trying to break out from depression. And part of the explanation was that Black women are not afforded the right to be depressed because our role in society is that of nurturer, of sex, of anger, of everything but ourselves and having our own identity. So my question is twofold. One, how do we make it beyond just the police, but an actual movement of mental health and Black women? And then I teach a feminism class, and the girls are of color. Some are Indian, Muslim, Black, Latina, a lot of different groups, but they don't see themselves as feminists. They don't see themselves as wanting equality. They think it's already there. And I try to explain intersectionality, I show the YouTube, everything. And they still, they don't get it. So if they don't get one part of, okay, feminism is for me, and they don't get that racism does still happen, and they don't get that mental illness can happen and does happen to women of color, what do we do?
Did everybody kind of generally hear the question? So she's talking about the work that she does as a teacher and the work that she does with young people. And the first example, talking about going to see an art exhibit based on the work of, inspired by Claudia Rankine's Citizen, and seeing works about Black women and depression, and then also talking about your work with students and thinking about how they think about and relate to feminist theory and how to connect or reframe the narrative, in this case, to let people find the links between those two things.
And your question goes to the heart of why we do what we do. We firmly believe that both of the problems that you identified, Black women not identifying mental health as a critical component to our well-being, and many young women not seeing themselves in the narrative around feminism, are two aspects of a discursive absence over the last decade, 2 decades, basically convincing us, number one, we got magic, so we don't need mental health care, right? You take away the capacity of a group to thrive, and they don't die. And when they don't die, we call that magic, right? Because we can't figure out how we're actually existing. And now we're at a point where we're kind of internalizing a normal situation in which we have virtually no resources. No one really speaks up for us in the communities that we're in the way that we should, and we still, prevail. We even make it sort of like a badge of honor, like, I don't need what other women need, because I'm not like that, I'm strong. So some of that I'm not like that is actually the prescription for the suffering that so many of our women face across profession, class, sexuality, everything. We see an erasure around the challenges for Black women and mental health. And I think at the same time we see an assumption that feminism is yesterday's news, an assumption that it's not for us, an assumption that goes to the core of this contemporary crisis that we're in. And I'll say this just to link back up and to wrap up, to go to this moment. When I hear people in our community and outside complaining about 45, I say, well, if you'd listened to Black women back when they were trying to tell you, this wouldn't have happened, and here's why. 45 is there because of 2 incredibly damaging Supreme Court cases. One that gutted the Voting Rights Act, and the other one that gutted campaign finance reform. I think history will eventually show us this. One state alone, 200,000 people were not allowed to vote, where his margin of victory was just 20,000. And that gets replicated in many different places. Those cases were decided by 1 vote. That 5th vote for those cases, Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas wound up on the Supreme Court. Why? Because when a Black woman came forward to say that this man is not qualified to be on the Supreme Court, that this man who was sworn to uphold civil rights laws actually violated them repeatedly in his harassment of me, the country was not willing to believe her. The Judiciary Committee, headed by Joe Biden, was not willing to stand up for her. And within the African American community itself, there was a rap on her saying, that's just some feminist stuff. That has nothing to do with Black women. Well, in fact, sexual harassment is a Black women's issue. Black women were the ones that were the first plaintiffs in sexual harassment cases. Why? Because sexual harassment is why we're here. Sexual harassment is the key to the productive capacity of slavery. Black women have been harassed sexually since we got here, and so we were the first ones to say if we have protection against discrimination, it should be protection against sexual harassment. But we didn't believe it because we don't tell our stories. The main story we don't know is that Rosa Parks, who we like to say started the civil rights movement because she refused to give up her seat because her feet were tired, did not start as a civil rights worker sitting on that bus. She started because she was a rape crisis investigator and advocate for the NAACP, for black women who were being raped in the South and did not have any access to justice. So there's a documentary out, everybody should see it. It's called The Rape of Recy Taylor, black woman who was gang raped by white men in 1944. Rosa Parks got her start there. So the entire Montgomery bus boycott was made possible because of the infrastructure that black women created when they were fighting against our sexual abuse. If we had known all of that history, if we'd been able to put it together, so when Anita Hill came forward, we'd say, we recognize this story. We know that this is what happens to black women. We know black women have been key to feminist movements, including the movement against sexual harassment. If we had believed her, then Clarence Thomas would not be sitting on the Supreme Court. And I firmly believe if he were not sitting on the Supreme Court, 45 would not be sitting in the White House right now. So these are histories we have to learn for our future, for all of our futures.
Thank you. And for anybody who wants to, as we continue, I think, to think about ways to reframe the narrative and also make sure that we have all of the history that we need to arm ourselves moving forward. If you go to the African American Policy Forum's website, they have incredible videos and reports and resources about all of these topics. You can join their mailing list and find out about all the incredible work that they're doing. Before we go, I do want to mention that these conversations beyond the stage have been happening after a number of the performances, and there's still a couple left before the closing of the show. If you go on the MTC website and there's any other conversation that you're interested in attending, you can just come by after the show and come on through for any of the conversations. They're free and open to you. These are sponsored by Jan Warner in memory of her husband, Arthur Warner. And I just want to say a huge thank you, not only to Kimberlé, thank you so much for giving us such an extraordinary frame, but also to these incredible two mothers who are here today. Thank you, Cassandra and Rhonda, for being here with us. Thank you. I know people have to go. Looks like we have one more comment, but please.
Just a comment real quick.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
My daughter is India Kager.
You have to come up.
I have to, okay. I just want to say this about the invisibility that excuse me, I was sitting on the floor. I love that thing there. But real quick, what Dr. Kimberlé Crenshaw was saying about the invisibility, I just want everyone to know, my name is Gina Best. I'm the mother of India Kager. She was the young woman who went to Virginia Beach to introduce her baby to the father of her son's family. Virginia Beach Police, I'm going to address the question of training. It was a SWAT team that ambushed, followed my daughter, waited until she went to 7-Eleven, ambushed her car while simultaneously throwing a flashbang grenade at India's car, and then proceeded to jump out, firing over 30 rounds into her car. The issue is this, on top of that, there was no arrest warrant, but my 4-month-old grandson, India's baby, was in the backseat of the car. And this is, they knew this, very similar to Corrine Games. India Kager was also a Navy vet. So when Dr. Kimberlé speaks of 45 being in office and this whole thing about take a knee and the controversy about that, people are still forgetting that the original reason why that started was because of what? Police brutality, police terrorism. So we suffer from PTSD, and that's police terrorism, stress syndrome ourselves. PTSD, we deal with that on an everyday basis, and yet our daughters are still invisible. Navy vet, innocent, no arrest warrant, nothing. In her car, Shelly with her friends, Tanisha. And you all don't know our faces, but we need you to see our faces because there's no need to be afraid of the dark. Absolutely no need to be afraid.
I just want to say too, I think as theater makers ourselves, our commitment is to telling stories. So just know on behalf of whoever the other artists are in this room that we are also committed to making sure that your stories get told and creating space for these stories to be out in the public, because that's the only way people can know about them and that we can move forward, right? Right. Great. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.